Hi, everyone, and welcome back. Thanks for joining us for part 2 here, where we will continue our discussion a bit more about participation. Now, according to another poll from the National Alliance for Youth Sports, nearly 70% of kids in the United States alone stop playing organized sports by the age of 13 because it's just not fun anymore. Now, if you have kids, you might not understand why this is happening, but a few years ago, the mass exodus, so to speak, of 13-year-olds from within organized sport began to reveal a trend that continues today. As sport tends to mirror society, we are currently seeing this trend continuing into all aspects of organized sport leagues and even in less structured, informal games. So we're challenged to keep everyone engaged. To fully understand participation, we have to look at the other end of the continuum, which is not just how young people become involved in sports, but to come to a clear understanding of what we can do to keep them engaged and prevent them from withdrawing. So as you see, sport really becomes a global and almost universal involvement. So that's why sports are popular all over the globe. And it's fascinating and emotional at the same time. So people will either watch it or they will participate in it. Most children or youth are in love with sports in some way, and many will have a sports idol and dream of becoming just like him or her. And whether a child's particular sport experience is rewarding can depend exclusively on the people who are in charge of the programs that they're involved in. The statement that it's not fun anymore really isn't the only problem, especially in advanced groups of higher age players. It's a consequence of a number of cultural, economic, and systemic issues that result in our kids turning away from organized sports at a time when they could really benefit from them quite a bit. Playing sports offers everything from physical activity, experiencing success, and bouncing back from failure, to taking calculated risks and dealing with the consequences, to working as a team and getting away from the bad habits that we're now commonly seeing in our largely inactive youth. Our children actually need sports now more than ever. Reasons for this departure from sports is largely based on things becoming less fun for kids to play sports. So we get that and we know it, and it's easy enough to withdraw from it if one chooses. But it's not fun anymore because it's not designed to be. As children get closer to high school age, the system of youth sports is really geared toward meeting the needs of more competitive players who have endured, showing some staying power. And they also have increased their skill levels to be able to stay competitive in their sport. In turn, the expectations placed on them increase. Often, the mentality is wrongly assumed that kids who quit at age 13 or so are the ones who wouldn't make a varsity team in high school anyway, but now we know that they may simply have had just a bad coach. But for those fortunate enough to be properly guided long enough to stick around, find that being on a team means a greater commitment of time and effort. This is also a factor for some who leave. They just maybe don't want to use all that time on sports. However, we also know it means being surrounded by people who care very much about the outcome. This consequently brings with it the potential for experiencing disappointment or being the cause of it. There's nothing wrong with any of that, and it can teach incredibly important lessons about hard work, resiliency, and character, but it's definitely not for everyone. Our culture no longer supports older kids playing just for the fun of it. The pressure to raise successful kids means that we expect them to be the best. If they're not, they're encouraged to cut their losses and focus on areas where they can maybe still excel. It's the same thing we see in middle school orchestra, for example, where a kid who doesn't make first chair begins to wonder if it's worth continuing to play. If a 7th grader doesn't make a select team for soccer, she might start to wonder maybe if it's time to quit altogether, thinking that if she's not hitting that highest level now, it might not be worth doing after all. In this case, a coach may not be able to persuade an athlete or young participant to stay in the sport, but a young athlete that's faced with the decision to stay or leave a sport should not feel it's necessary due to bad coaching or poor leadership from the coach. Now, for the small minority of kids who are playing a sport at an elite level and able to enjoy a higher level of competition, the idea of quitting around that problem period or problem age of 13 is probably something they never thought of, and it's still probably something they consider unthinkable. But for everyone else, the reality is that there are fewer opportunities to play as we get older, and a more competitive and less developmental environment in which to participate, and a lot of other commitments competing for any free time that would be available after school. There is also a clear push for kids to specialize and achieve at the highest possible level. Increasingly, kids are pressured to find their passion and excel in that area, be it music, arts, sports, or whatever. There are certainly kids for whom this is not true, but it's not the norm. For many, there's a strong argument against this trend because the message is essentially to pick one thing and specialize in it to the exclusion of pursuing maybe other interests. For young athletes, early specialization can be harmful in terms of long-term injuries, and it does little to increase one's overall chances of later collegiate or professional success. Maybe even more importantly, the underlying message that I have to be the best or I failed is really deeply harmful to kids. This is absolutely mirrored and reinforced in schools where the environment is increasingly test and outcome driven. Sports could be pivotal in teaching kids how to fail and recover, something that educators and parents see as being desperately needed. In privileged communities across the globe, teenagers find themselves stressed to the point of developing anxiety or depression, and we see unhealthy coping behaviors and increased rates of self-harm and suicide. This is not a sports problem as much as it is a cultural problem. And on one hand, society looks to sport to protect children and youth from this sort of behavior. But on the other hand, if we have failed participants through bad coaching or providing a bad experience, a player who drops out may have ill effects or negative consequences from this for life. But there is a cost to being competitive, and not everyone is really willing or able to pay it. For kids, playing at a more competitive level can mean having to prioritize their commitments and their interests and to work more tirelessly toward a goal. Very often, it also means that they have to be able to deal with the pressures of participating at a higher level if they want to continue. Kids actually seem to figure this part of sports out pretty early on. These can be positive things, though, for kids, provided that the environment they're playing in is a healthy one. But there are other factors that contribute to a young athlete's ability, and that's not just to be competitive, but to be seen by others as competitive. We also have to question the cost to not just the athlete, but their families as well. Now, the requirements to stay in sport have changed quite a bit. Now it includes training year-round, somewhat expensive equipment, individualized coaching, camps, tournaments, and participation on travel or specialty teams. Yet, in many places, these factors of playing are no longer really considered optional for success in youth sports, at least not heading into high school level play. The investment of time and money of these requirements is substantial for the parents. This can contribute to an environment where kids of lower income or single parent families are simply shut out of participation or play. Of course, it's just a number, but at 13, kids generally find themselves with more and more challenging schoolwork, and most are also being encouraged by parents or other peers to start choosing what interests them more and what they might be best at. There's no longer time for them to do as much as they did in elementary school or middle school, so school becomes more serious, and this is also true for staying in sports. Some of the major social and emotional changes that 13-year-olds experience also seem to predispose them to making decisions such as quitting sports, especially as that environment becomes more and more competitive to them. The CDC describes this type of adolescent behavior on its developmental milestones page as a phase where there's a focus on themselves, and it's characterized by a going back and forth between higher expectations and a lack of self-confidence. Kids become more focused on and influenced by their friends, and many of these friends are also walking away from organized sports at the same time. Any discussion about being 13 or really a teenager of any age also needs to include talking about social media, smartphones, and the internet. Now, according to the Pew Center's Internet Research Study, most U.S. kids receive their first cell phone or wireless device by the age of 12. Between the ages of 13 and 17, 92% of teenagers report being online every day, and 24% are online almost constantly. As kids become teenagers, their priorities will change. How they socialize, study, and spend their time changes with them as well. This also seems to affect youth participation in sport or organized activities. All of this collectively represent what we might call the perfect storm. There's no really easy answers for us, and the youth system of sports seems to be set up to cater to more elite players as they approach high school, leaving average kids behind with fewer opportunities. Our culture encourages specialization now more and more, and achievement is emphasized more than fun, which actively discourages kids from trying new things or just playing for fun. And all of this converges at a time when our youth are trying to go through major physical, emotional, and even social changes, as well as facing pressure to pare down their extra interest and focus more on school. It almost seems like we're getting the message confused. So then why do 70% of kids quit organized sports at age 13, and what can we really do about it? One could argue that most kids leave because we're not giving them a way to stay in sport. And maybe more importantly, until we deconstruct the parenting culture that emphasizes achievement and success over healthy, happy kids, we will be at a disadvantage to solve the problem. Now that we know a lot more about the participants who play sports, our next lesson will dive into how to plan your programs for youth coaching.